Yep, good evening. Last session, we learned about how to use Formic for as third-party forms. And one more point we learned is about validation. We discussed about Formic and validation. For Formic validation using YUP, right? With YUP library, we learned about how to handle Formic validation. That means gradually we are simplifying the approach. So gradually we are simplifying the approach. That means we are reducing the logic that we have to write. So first level, at level 1, what we have done at level 1. So we have designed custom function, am I right? For validation. We designed custom function for validation. So we defined custom validation messages. So we have custom binding of events. So all we have to write manually. At level 1, what we done is we designed a custom function for validation. We written our own messages and we binded with them events. In level 2, where we have done only Formic, right? So here it is without Formic, right? Without Formic, we have done like this. At level 2, what we done? So at level 2 with Formic, so we reduce it a little bit. What we have to do is, here again, we have to design custom function. First, custom function for validation, we have to write. We have to write custom function for validation. That is common. Second, what we have to do is custom validation messages, but so no binding events are required, right? No binding events required. No binding events required. So what we have done, we used predefined events of Formic. Formic have predefined events. We used them. So with Formic, we have defining, right? We have level 1. Without Formic, we designed everything manually. With Formic, we have done our own function, our own messages, but our own events not required. Or we are depending on ready-made events available by Formic. In level 3, so what we done with Formic with YUP, we made it more simple. That means we can use, instead of custom functions, that means no custom validation. Okay, what we have to use, predefined validation schema. Yesterday we discussed that ready-made schemas we are using. So one more option is predefined error messages also, errors. We don't need to write even error message, automatically it will fire up. We can override those error messages. This is what we have done up to now. That means we are level by level, we are reducing. And here binding is same, right? So we use predefined events for events of Formic. Here also we have to use predefined events of Formic, on change and all these we have to use. So this is a level by level approach. As I already told you that when we are not satisfied with ready-made functions given by them, then we will go with level 2. We write our own functions. Even the given predefined functions, they are up to certain limit. Some functions are not provided according to your requirement. Then again, you have to write your own, right? That's the reason you may work at any level. You have to use all the three things. Now we will go with, so level 4, here we will do more easy. That means actually formic and formic provides formic components. We will use formic components. Till now you have used only a basic formic library. So we have to use formic components now. That means what is the point is formic provides predefined components for designing a form, so form field and error messages. For designing a form, for designing a field in the form, and for designing error message, they have ready-made components. That means earlier what we done is from level 1 to 3. From level 1 to 3, we used HTML form. We used a HTML form. From level 1 to 3, we used a HTML form. And we used HTML span. We used HTML divs for displaying messages, right? To show error message, to display the messages, we are using form, span, div. For fields, what we have done, input, we have select, all these things we have done from level 1 to 3. But now what you can do is formic provides components. These components are, we have a formic component. We have a formic component. We have a form component, form. So we have a field component. We have an error message component. As we already know in a React, what is meant by a component? Component means all these days we are designing components. Component means it is a combination of markup, styles, and logic. And these are already having that. That means for a form, they have a ready-made component. What is difference between HTML form and formic form? HTML form have to use submit event. It have to use the submit event to find out the form submitted or not. It have to collect the data from the form manually and submit those details. But what is the specialty about this component is it can identify the submit automatically. It can identify the submit. It internally have that mechanism. That means it is designed in such a way that it can handle your interactions easily. Predefined, ready-made. This simplifies your validations. This simplifies your designing of forms. It will be more simple when compared to level 1 to 3 you have seen, right? So what is formic component? Actually simple. Actually formic, let me give you one by one. Formic is nothing but it configures a container. It configures a container that can handle form. So a container, formic is a container which can handle collection of multiple forms. That means already I told you one point. I hope you already know in HTML also. Suppose we are designing a page. Let's say here, yeah. Suppose in a HTML, I am designing form. So this is a form and this is the body section. and we have a form. Now close, and we have another form. So like this. Now, is it valid? Can a page have multiple forms? Yes, of course. A page can have multiple forms. Why? What is objection in that? What is problem? In a page, you can have a register form, login form, right? That means you can have multiple forms in a page. So now another point is here. So can we have a form inside another form? So this is the form. Can we have a form another inside the form? It's not possible. You cannot have a form inside another form. You can have multiple forms. You can have multiple forms, but we cannot have a form inside another form. You cannot have a form inside another form. Then how you manage such forms? Actually, in real world, we need that. For example, you opened account details. All account details came. In that personal information, password information, or some address information. In that only address you are changing and you are submitting, only address need to update. Our entire form should not post. Earlier in JavaScript and jQuery, to handle this, we have to use Ajax, right? We need to use Ajax. By using Ajax, we can design such containers so that only specific portion of the form can be submitted. Because you cannot design a form inside another form, you have to use these techniques. Actually, the main concept of using these components is allowing such type of hierarchy. The main concept about using these components is allowing such hierarchy. Later, when we learn about routing, I will show you Ajax, how it internally uses. But these kind of situations are very common. And to handle these situations, we have to use these components. That is the reason there is a difference between the uppercase FORM and the lowercase form. This is your HTML form, and this is a formic form. We have HTML forms, we have formic forms. And this is a component. This component allows other markup inside it. That makes it simplified to handle multi-levels of submissions. So which we will see later. First, we will take a simple. Now, this is a component, right? The component you can design. This is a formic. And form is nothing but it configures a form. It configures a form with a set of fields. Another, we have field. Actually, field, it configures a form element like text, like checkbox, like radio, etc. All these are defined with field. And very important, error message. Error message is nothing but actually it configures a container that can catch the errors returned by form. Actually, it is a div-align span-like container, but it is internally designed in such a way that it can catch the problems in the form. That's very good. That means you will see that it is very effective. It is very simple to handle the interactions. Let's see that. So how to design this? Now we have a formic, and we have a form, and we have a field, and we have an error message. How to design it syntactically? We have to design like this. First, we have to configure the main container formic. We have to design the main container formic. This formic component configures what a form is going to handle. That means it will use initial values. Initial values is an object. It will use validation schema. Validation schema is an object. It will use on submit. On submit is a function, right? It is a function. That means you have to configure everything here. Means actually everything is a function. So here also we configure dynamic data. This object contains a function which will return some functionality. That's how we have to configure. This is formic. Now inside this formic, you can have a form. Inside the formic, you can have a form. And this form can design your markup. That means you can design your form here. That means this can design your markup. That means, so in this form, you can have a field. That means form contains collection of fields. Now, how you will decide that this field is a text box or a password or a radio or a checkbox? For that, we have to just use type. Type indicates it can be text, it can be like number, it can be like email, right? It can be like password. All these you can define as types. But complex types, that means which are not defined with input type. So that means field. Suppose you want a radio button. You want a drop down. Then field will use as select. As. We have to use as. Field type is used for input types. Input type radio, input type checkbox, input type text box, buttons, everything. Right? So if it is select or if it is text area, am I right? So if it is a data list, we have a data list. HTML have a data list, right? Data list is used for auto completions and all, right? We have HTML data list. So these are separate elements. We have a meter, we have a progress, right? These kind of other elements which are designed by using so other types, not input type. They are defined as, we have to configure as, right? That means we have to define the field. And very important, every field can have an error message. You have to just use error message. You have to use an error message. That's it. Now this field will have a name. Suppose this field have a name called mobile, right? And this error message will bind with that mobile. That means whatever the validations you mentioned for this mobile, it will catch them and display. It will catch those messages and it will display. This makes your form more simplified. This makes the form more simplified. That means here what we are doing, we are designing a form with not HTML, with React components. These are all React components, predefined components provided by Formic library. So we have to import and use them. This is Formic. Validation schema is designed by using YUP. YUP is used for validation schema. So you can use without validation schema also. Without validation schema, you have to write validation function. You have to write your own function. So formic can be used with validation schema or validation function. Validate function will ask you to design your own function. Schema will ask you to use the schema object for verifying the details and managing them. This is more simplified. Let's see how we can design this, means how we can create this one. So let's go to our HTML. Here we will create. Previously, we have to use a lot of input bindings, get field properties, bind them and all. Let's create another file here. Yeah. So I will say, validation component .js. Validation component.js. Yeah. Okay. So export default. So function, and we have validation component. So it should return a markup. So class name container fluid. Okay. And here I will put a simple option, some register user. Okay. So let's keep this validation component in the startup. Okay. Now in this, we will design here. First, we have to import use formic from formic. That is one. Now another one we have to import. So from right? From you have to import all schemas as from and here you need some more now from formic. Formic requires a formic component. Formic requires a field component. Formic requires error message component. Formic requires a form component. All these we have to import. These are all the predefined components provided by formic. Now, how do we design the form? Here we have to create formic. We have to configure formic. Inside the formic, we need to design a form. We have to design a form. And inside the form, we need to create the presentation markup. That means we need to design the markup. So data list, data term, some username, data definition, we will keep it. So similarly, another data term, so password, data definition, leave it empty. So another data term, some age, so some data definition, so empty. So this is like some email. Okay. Now here we have a button. So we have a button. So button. And here we need to configure. Everything should be in one container. Everything should be in one container. In one container. And button is some register. Like this we are configuring, right? Now this is a simple form we designed here. It have only those field names there. Now how you define a field for this text box? Means we need a text box for that username. Here I have to just use a field. I have to use a field. I have to use a field. And what is the field type? Field type is text. So that is field type is text. That means it is a text box, right? So similarly, I have a field. So what is the field type? Suppose field type, this is also text. That means the field type is text. And here also a field. So field, and field type is equal to text. Number Suppose I said number, I'm giving number. It's a numeric up down. Yeah, all types you can define, password, email, any type you have defined. Here I am configuring number, right? So I will use text so that I can validate numbers. You can use anything here. Okay, now next important is field is ready. Suppose I will add an extra field just to make you understand. Suppose if it is city, it is a drop down, then we have to use an field and the field not type, field as what select. So field as select, we are defining the field as select drop down. But how you define the option inside it? Suppose in this drop down we are creating an option, so we have some option Delhi, that means it is having that option. Other options are same, child elements are similar, that means we are creating an option. So Hyderabad, this is an option here configured there. Right now your form looks little bit simple, no much complications yet, but still you have just only designed, right? Validations, nothing configured. So our formic have to handle these values from the form. So formic needs a property initial values. It's an object. So I will break it. I will put it in a next line. Don't get confused. Right? Into that object, I need to configure the object with key and values. That means dynamic values we are passing into it. So we have to pass the key and values. Key is, so we have the key username, right? Username, it is a string. So we have an email, so that is a string. We have an age, that is a string. We have a city, that is a string. This is finished. Remember, this is initial values. Initial values. You don't need a comma because this is a component, HTML component. That means now you have to add one more attribute. Just like how you are using a HTML element, right? Another attribute I have to write. What is another attribute? Validation schema. Validation schema, right? Here we have to define another. What is it? This is finished, na? Yeah. Here this is finished. Let me end it here. This is related to initial values. Okay. Next we have validation schema. Validation schema we have to define. Validation schema is equal to, again dynamically, it requires an object. Here you have to access, what is it? Yup dot object. So yup object, we need to configure that yup object here and define. So that means it uses the key and values and defines the keys and values. That means we have to specify. So type of yup, it is type of yup, right? So you have to configure this yup object. And already we learned yup uses an object here. And how do we configure? What is it? Comma is expected. Where? I'm using an yup dot object. Yeah. Here we need to configure yup object. It contains properties and values. What are the properties and values? Properties and values related to fields. What is that? Username. You know already. We have to use an yup, right? We have to use an app. What is the data type? It is string. And we need to add some min, right? Min, how much? 4. So we have to add any error message here. So name to short, that is the error message. Then we have to add max, that is 10. That means name to long, like this we define. And one more we are adding required, that is name required. these are all the options. This is related to username. Similarly, you need to configure for email. So we are using yep dot string and we have email. You can put a message invalid email, any message you want. And I told you that they have default messages also. We have another option, age uses an yep dot, it is an number is, and we can have range of values also. I will keep required also for everyone. So age required and email also required. That means here I say email required. And even you don't define the message, default message will come. And we are just giving city, and city is not having any validations. We will just give as a word type string, because you cannot keep any required or anything here. For drop downs, you have to write your functions, own functions. Already I told you custom validation. Don't get confused. Many times people ask like, do you have any idea of writing custom validation? Custom validation is nothing but you are writing your own validation functions and schemas. That means you are not using, you are just writing your own functions. That is custom validation. You need custom validation in various occasions. Okay, so this is done. We need another option. What is it? On submit. On submit, we need to collect all the values, and we need to, so alert what json.string5, whatever the values submitted. These all options are defined inside formic tag, actually inside formic tag. That means we designed all these inside the formic tag. You see here we done everything. We have to configure everything here. I just, for clarity's sake, I used lines, right? Everything is actually in the start tag of component. Initial values, validation schema, on submit, everything you configured here. Now, important is how you will bind these initial values to these form fields. Just we have to use name property. This field have to bind with which one? Username. This field will bind with email. This field will bind with name. It is with age. This field will bind with name, what? City. That's it. And we want error messages for them. Then what we will do is, I will put a data definition. Here we will use error message field. Just error message field. And this error message should be for user name. That's it. Similarly, I will put here some class. So I will use some class name text danger. And you see here another data definition. So here I am giving class name as text danger. And here I am using another, what is it? Error message. This is for name, error message for email. Same, I need error message for age. I need error message for age. That's it. So there is no event binding here. That means we are not writing handle change. We are not using any field properties, get field properties for binding. Just we are using the basic reference names and configuring it. Now this is the form here we configured with the details, and register, it will work. Everything looks very simplified now. Everything looks very simplified. That means previously lot of event binding, lot of value bindings, lot of methods, just ready-made component, right? Just ready-made component to configure here. So I'm entering the details here. I'm entering the details, name too short, everything same. So everything working fine. So everything is working fine, right? It says it must be a number. Everything is working fine. So I selected some city and register. It have to submit all the details. No on submit, no on change, no on blur, right? No event bindings here, just ready-made components. This is more simplified. Then many times people have a doubt like, then why we haven't learned this first directly? It looks very simple, right? You cannot do this every time. We cannot do this every time because several presentations are not possible with the components provided by Formic. Not possible, right? Suppose I need to design a table, I need to design a card like design. In that I need to keep some data and present it. Not possible. Formic can't do that. That means Formic, it can do up to certain limit, but this is good. So what is advantage of these ready-made components provided by Formic? The advantage of all these ready-made components is we can simplify the process. But you have to check your situation and requirements. That means what is your requirement? For that you need component is enough, not enough, then you write your own fields. You can have combination of everything inside. That means you can keep your own validation schemas. You can write your own validation function inside. Even though you are using this, you can write your own options. Why? Because already they have the options like on blur, on change, we can write them. So this is very simplified. So see, we are just using a Formic, defined initial values, we defined the validation schema for it, and we are collecting the data on submit. Formic contains a form. In the form, we designed a simple container which contains field. So these are all the fields. Field is binded with initial values just by name. Error message also binded with initial values and validation schema just by name. But here, this mapping is very important. Mapping is very important. Actually, in real world projects, we call, means if anybody asks how it is happening in the background, that means how it is happening in the background, we call this technique as model binding. We call this technique as model binding. That means if anybody asks, see, this is very extreme experience level, right? At very extreme experience level, if anybody asks like how it is happening, means just by writing a name, how it is doing all the validation, right? I haven't written any event, I haven't written anything, how it is doing all this. That means what is the architecture behind this? And software developers knows that this architecture is called as model binding. In web technologies, model binding is a technique which specifies actually, so model binding is actually name and field. Actually, we call as name and field mapping. We call it as name and field mapping. Model binding uses a name and field mapping technique. That means internally they use a framework. By using that framework, actually model binding is one of the popular framework provided by MVC. So MVC, Model View Controller. That means, that is what I said in the beginning when you remembered about React. I said that React is a library. It is not a framework, but React is using a lot of frameworks, right? It is a library. It is a library, but drawback with library, it cannot build the, it cannot control the application flow. It needs support of various frameworks. And how this all working means framework. Some framework is there in the background. That model binding. Model binding is actually managed by the framework called MVC. That means name and location mapping, actually name and field mapping. So this is also name and location mapping. Name and location mapping. That means in software applications, the frameworks have a predefined architecture. That means what name you give, where you keep the file, that also matters. That means what name you give, where you keep the file, that also matters. That also matters. Actually, for that, in the background, they built it. In the background, they built it. Actually, later you will learn. I told you at the end, I will discuss about the concept Webpack. Right? Webpack. Actually, this is all related to a framework and data binding approach happening in the background. So we will learn how this Webpack handles everything. Actually, you see, means already many people asked this. I told you that we will discuss at the end. So which component index.js? Index.js is telling to render, right? Index.js is telling to render into this root element. Where is that root element? Root element is present in index.html. Am I right? In index.html, it is there. Index.html, there is a div called root. Now in index.html, there is no script file index included. There is no index.js. Right? If without script file, how that script is working? Right? Without the script file, how that script is working? You know that basically you learn that a script need to be linked. Na? Without linking, how it is working? There is no script file written anywhere. There is no index file written anywhere. Then how it is taking control? So that means it is using certain framework architecture in the background. That framework architecture allows to handle these all bindings. That at the end I will explain, because now it is too much to discuss. That means you can't take it once I start discussing this. That's the reason at the end we will learn. Because for that you need to learn all topics. Everything you should be perfect. Once you say, I finish React, I know everything in React, now you can learn Webpack. That means you can learn how to build your application yourself. Where to keep the resources, what should be the folder name, what should be the file name. That means even these names will be important. That means, for example, suppose, for example, if you don't use this public folder, you don't use this folder src, you change the name of the folder, it will not work anymore now. Because in the architecture, they given mapping to the names. So that is the background. You will learn, you will understand about that. But this is one important point. That means if anyone asks like how it is working, just by using a name, how it is working, that is actually by using a technique, model binding, mapping technique. We call this as mapping, model binding. That means actually, I will show a simple approach here. Generally, we have a framework, the model. So MVC framework, we have a view and we have a controller. I hope many people know about this, right? Already, I hope you people heard about this MVC, huh? MVC framework. MVC is available everywhere, right? Every technology knows MVC. We have a model, view, and a controller. I'm just giving overview. If necessary, later I will detailedly discuss about this framework whenever situation comes. Model is nothing but model contains data. Model contains data. And a view is the UI, user interface. And the controller contains the application logic. That means it contains the application logic. That means what happens, controller is responsible for handling communication between the model and the view. That means what controller will do is in the backend, so it uses a mapping, right? It uses a mapping technique. Now in the data, you have a field called price. In the data, you have a field called price. And in the UI, you have the name as price. Then automatically controller can map this price to this particular field. Name mapping. It will map to the same name. That is the reason sometimes actually many times people ask, like, website starts with a page called index. If a website have index page, then automatically it starts. Right? Every website have a index page, automatically it starts. You need to access index page. You need to access the index page. If a website have a index page, automatically it starts with index page. That means it can identify the name index.html. Now people ask, like, can I use any another page, home.html as startup page? You can. You have to change in the architecture. Right? Server have an architecture. In the server architecture, startup is given as index. Right? I hope you know already that even in Windows, when you are loading Windows, you can keep programs in startup. That means when Windows loads, by default, I want some apps to load. That means whenever I load my PC, automatically Paint and Notepad should open and get ready. I hope you know where to keep. When I load my PC, automatically you see in the status, you can see actually in the status, these all are loaded now. I am not loading Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, all are loaded automatically. How they are loaded? That means they are set in the startup. Can we change? We can change. The given settings now, right? We can change. That means that is related to architecture. So that is the reason in the background, this mapping technique is working. This mapping technique is responsible for identifying the resources just by using the name reference. That is the reason even you mismatch this with lowercase price, it cannot map. That means it cannot work. That means you have to match exact name. That means uppercase P. It should match with that. That is what actually name mapping is. So at architectural level, so these kind of questions are very rare. Very rare means you put 10 years experience, then they will ask these kind of questions. Right? So until that, you don't need to worry about these kind of questions, right? Because you show because you see, generally many people see, suppose you are a project lead or a team lead in a company, and you want to change your company, and some other company have to take you, then again you will have to undergo interview. That means now imagine, now you have a doubt, like 10 years a software developer worked as a project lead, right? As a project lead. Now what should I ask him? What is there to ask? But still we have questions for him. Right? We have questions for him. We have questions for a 20 years experienced project manager also. That means technology is vast. Don't think that you will able to learn everything in the class. Right? Certain things we can't touch. And those things you will not use regularly. Very rarely out of 3-4 projects, one project may be using this, and you have a situation to use it. Then you will have to explore by yourself. It is not possible in a class anybody to deal with all the topics, right? impossible, because hundreds of properties, functions, methods will be there. It's not possible. So if anyone asks how this is working in the background, so only one answer for this. What is it? Model binding. So it is name mapping, right? It is using name and location mapping. And name and location mapping, this is the concept behind this. And it is actually through a framework called MVC, Model View Controller. Actually, what you are watching on screen, that means this field and this error message, am I right? Error message, this belongs to view. This belongs to view, user interface, right? And what belongs to controller? What belongs to controller? Actually, the options belongs to controller is handle change. So it is handle blur. So that is handle submit. Handle submit. But in this component, what they have done is they haven't given these options. Internally, they are performed. Internally performed. That means these are internally configured, but internally these are managed by whom? Controller. Controller. Now, what is the role of model here? The role of model is nothing but it is storing your data. Name and value, am I right? Name, value, checked, all these, the properties where data is stored. Name, value, checked, all these are the options where data is stored. That is model. This is the mapping that happens actually, right? So whatever the name you given, the name you attach to field, the name you attach to error message. That is how it actually works. So internally, it is built with this kind of framework. So React is not a framework, but React is using various frameworks. So it can use MVC, it can use MVVM, it can use MVP, model view presenter, model view models. So many are there. I just given you one simple approach of how it works, right? So this is okay. This is working fine. We have seen how data is submitted and managed. Let me give you this example. So this is the example of validation component. This is the example for validation component. Let me copy this. Now here, this is one option. Another important means some more points are there about this validation. Another important in the validation, we have a concept called, so means we use a concept called validation state. Validation state. So validation state is very important while working with validations. Validation state. Validation state is nothing but actually validation state defines the validation status of form and field. Validation state defines the validation status of form and field. It defines the status of form and field. That means, for example, suppose, so validation state is nothing but, for example, let's see here. I don't want register button to work until or unless all fields are valid. How you will verify all fields are valid? Every field valid, we are verifying. Fine. Every field valid, we are verifying. Right now, how do we collect all the details together and verify that all are valid, all are invalid? Lot of logic we have to write actually. That means to verify every field, that means is A valid, is B valid, is C valid? We have to write lot of conditions. And through the conditions, We have to verify that all fields are valid. Any one field is invalid. But this can be easily handled by using validation state. Validation state. What validation state can do is it can crawl. So it can crawl over all fields in a form. It can crawl over all fields in a form and verify the validation state. So validation state, which can be true. Validation state will be true if it is valid. If it will be false if it is invalid. That means what this validation state can do is it can crawl over all the fields. From begin to end, it can read every field and it will verify, is it true, false. That means, is it valid or invalid? So if it is valid, then display one message, invalid another message. Actually, so you can design validation status by manual approach, but it is very difficult. A lot of logic need to be required, but this is simple. You can easily handle the validation state. How this validation state works? Actually, formic and yup provides validation state at two levels. So we have form state validation, and we have input state validation. Form state validation is nothing but verifying all fields. Input state validation is nothing but verifying specific field. And for input state validation, you can use error message. Am I right? Already we used for verifying every field valid or not. We are using error message. We are already using for form state validation. So you can use the validation properties returned by form component. Validation properties written by form component. Currently, you designed a form which is not returning any properties. Actually, you see here, you designed a form. This form is not returning anything. Just you designed a form and it is individually dealing with validations in the fields. Now, if this form, you can catch all, in order to catch all the problems in the form, this form should return some value. That means this entire component must return some value. So to verify all the fields, that means how you will verify all the fields in this form? It should return all fields. No? Am I right? It should return all fields. How this form can return all the fields? How it can return all the fields? See what I am doing now. I will remove this part. Currently, we just designed a form which is handling the component fields, right? But now what we will do, we will write an expression, dynamic. In this expression, we will use a parameter properties. And what we want the properties is, these properties are written by this form, understood? That means what we have done is, what is this indicates? Written. Am I right? It is a lambda expression, na? Right? It indicates written. What it is returning? Form. Understood? It is returning form. Where it is stored? properties, and you see the properties contains all of them. That's good. It's very simple now. That means you can access all of them. You can access all of them just by using this technique. That means this component is returning all of them. So let me keep this way. Yeah. Now that means these properties can access all the properties at a time. That's easy to verify then. That means actually this props contains, you see, you have a button. For a button, I will give disabled. Disabled, I will put an expression. We will access the props. If props is, you can see, is valid. So is valid. That means props is valid. Valid means all fields are valid. I will tell you various validation states. There are so many validation states. Actually, form validation states. So form validation state includes. So three things. One is valid, is valid. One is valid. Another one is dirty. Another one is touched. Form and input state validation contains these options: is valid, dirty, and touched. Is valid, so that means it will return true. Understood? It will return true if all fields are valid. If all fields are valid, then it will return true. What dirty will do? Dirty will return true if any one field modified. If any one field modified, that means you open the form. For example, you see several websites have a form. In that form, there is a save button. Save button is not enabled until or unless you do some modification. Right? Unnecessarily, we will not enable save button. We will enable save button only when there is some modification. Right? That means they will not able to even save if they haven't done any modification. Of course, that is available everywhere. Even in MS Word, save button will be there. It will not highlight if you don't do anything. You done some modification, then it will highlight. How we'll know whether it is modified or not? That is dirty. Touched is nothing but it returns true on blur. On blur of any field, it will return true. Blur means losing focus. Touched means you went there and came out without doing any modification, just went there and came out. That means that is touched. You went there and done some modification, that is dirty. Dirty means you went into the field and done some modification. You went into the field and without modification came out. That means you touched. That is touched, that is dirty. So actually, validation services have a lot of technical words. These we can use in various, means different other third-party validation have different terms. Like we have pristine. Pristine means not modified. Dirty means modified. We have valid, invalid, so many options will be there. Actually, see here, this is field property. That means is valid. Is valid. Then what I am doing here I am using a question mark. Question mark, I will keep true or I will keep as false. So is valid, that means it is some false, and I will keep as true. That is a dynamic expression I am defining. That means actually here, so when you design the form, so when you configure the form, these options need to be defined. Now you have some issues here. Let's check here. What is the form here? No, there is no issue. What is there? Somewhere the form returning is missing. So where we missed something. Cell in the hierarchy where we missed properties. It is properties. Yeah, that is fine. This is it's okay, right? I just added some wrong syntactically. Actually, what we done, we used props. Directly, it should return a form. Okay. Directly, it should return a form. What I done is accidentally I used this curly brace because this itself is written. This will not say return type. This indicates it is void. This you use a block, that means it indicates that it is void. So this is it is not void. It has to return what? Form. It has to return form. That's what only the problem here. Okay. Now here, so very important is, suppose you see now required and you see register button is disabled. Register button is disabled. Now I entered here the name. So name, I entered some email, I entered some age. Now again enabled. That is form state. That is form state. You can submit now. If any field is invalid, then it will be disabled. If all fields are valid, then it will be enabled. It will be enabled. That is a simple validation state. That means we can verify. So here button is disabled. How it is disabled? Props is verifying all the fields. That means props, I just given props. You can just give, so all fields. So here, suppose I'm just giving the reference, right? Oh, yeah. I'm just giving the reference here. Suppose here we are nothing but we are collecting all the fields, right? That means we are collecting all the fields. That means here we are defining all the fields. We are collecting all the fields. We are using all the fields and returning all the fields. That means all fields. So you see it is not working. By default, it is using all of them on change, on blur, because it's a component. Previously, we have to write on blur separate, on change separate. Now you can see you went there, you lose the focus from there without typing anything, then it is required. And the register button not working. So you entered something, now it is fine. Others also not satisfied. You need to enter other details. Age required. You need to enter. If all are valid, then it will work. This is the validation state, how you can configure the validation state. That simplifies the validation. This, if I have to do with my actual general React without third party, too complicated. This we can use by using such validation components. Actually, you learned only one third party. This is so validation state. Validation state. I will copy this. You learned only one third party. Now imagine this is a free one, and you paid for a library. So like Telerik, like Formix, then you can imagine more features will be there. More simplification will be there. More simplified, more features, right? More validation abilities, right? More simple interactions. We are using a free library, right? Now, if you purchase a library, then you can imagine its abilities. That makes very simple, but that depends on requirement. So if you know one library, you must able to explore all others by yourself. I will show you one more example, another library, how we can handle another third party. Then we can go into very major concept about the hooks. What is life cycle hooks of components? We will discuss that. Very important for React interviews, React hooks. And in real world implementation also, hooks play the key role, right? That we'll see next session. Tomorrow we'll do that, right? In tomorrow's session, we will continue with this. Okay, right.